Let me start by responding to something that Mr. Saxena said regarding Hemwati Nandan Bahuguna and his views on the Muslim community, particularly the Muslim community, because the heart of the communal issue that is under discussion is basically the hostility that exists for the Muslim community under the present establishment. Hemwati Nandan Bahuguna was a very close friend of my father's. And my father, as Admiral Ramdas has told you, was a military man, the founder of the National Defense Academy, and therefore the structure of training which he laid down is one that still subsists in the academy. So the mentality of generations of army leaders in the country was in fact conditioned by that kind of training. But yes, when Mr. Bahuguna said this regarding partition, it's important that we actually give it due consideration. But the point is that what happened in partition, it is what has colored community relations ever since. The relationship between the two communities, the two largest communities, was not always as vitiated as it has been after partition and as it exists today. Because you mentioned decades and centuries. Decades, yes, but I would not agree on centuries. It has passed through highs and lows. There have been different phases. But partition, in fact, was something opting for which really amounted to a suicidal action by the community. And in that, I can only say that in fact, the majority of India's Muslims did not support partition. The majority of India's Muslims in UP did support partition. And that came out of the minority complex. And I can say that with a good degree of authority, because I belong to the UP, as do you. But not only that, my grandmother was a leader of the Muslim League in UP, and very closely associated with Muhammad Ali Jinnah, at whose instance she gave up the parda and actually fought elections. An interesting side to those elections, if I might be allowed the liberty, she was fighting against another Muslim lady, because you had separate electorates at that time. So the Muslim lady concerned with Majda Bano, who was supported by Rafi Ahmed Qadwai. And when the elections were over, he gave her a ring, because the Qadwais are relations of ours too, and said, "Begum Sahab, aap to haar gaye." उन्होंने कहा, "ये कैसे कह सकते हैं आप? अभी तो नतीजे निकले नहीं हैं." उन्होंने कहा, "इसलिए कि क्योंकि आपने पर्दा छोड़ दिया है, जब भी आप तकरीर करने निकलती थी, तकरीर मीन्स भाषण करने निकलती थी, तो आप एक ही जगह जा सकती थी। जब आप तकरीर एक जगह कर रही थी, माजदा बानो 5 जगह तकरीर कर रही थी, क्योंकि वो बुर्के पोश थी। तो अब आप नहीं जीत सकती हैं." Actually, she won that election. But the fact is that Majda Bano continued to be in burqa. And so there was this trend. The Muslim League also tended to give the Muslims the feeling that they were leading them towards modernity. And, as you know, among the last states to actually succumb to the lure of the Muslim League and actually vote the Muslim League back happened to be the Punjab, which had the most syncretic culture of all in India. And there, unless the Fazl Hassan a Muslim chief minister, they stoutly resisted the law of the Muslim League. And the Muslim League won the loyalty by means very similar to what you have described, being the RSS strategy. Very similar. By projecting extremists, of course in those days they didn't have sophistication of internet and cyberspace, but rumors, stories about how after India became independent, the Muslims would be obliterated and so on. So that is what they succumbed to, and that is why we also know that partition in Punjab was the bloodiest. And that has left a stain on our civilization, which has colored communal relations, and also accounts for what you say that the attitude towards different minorities, different communities is yes and no. But so far as the Muslims is concerned, it is a no-no. That, I would put it to you, sir, is the explanation for that attitude. The fact is that I have been in the IAS, a successor of Mr. Saxena's at the Academy. Therefore, my experience has been that of joining the Academy in 1968. We just celebrated our golden reunion. We had been up to Missouri to celebrate that all together. In 1968, when I joined the IAS, a leading journalist from India, Mr. Chanchal Sarkar, came up, traveled all the way to Missouri to interview me. So I said, why have you come all the way to interview me? So he said, sir, you are the only Muslim in all the All India services. I hadn't realized that myself, but that was in fact the case. When I was director of the Academy, there were a whole lot of Muslims in all the services. And now, in the last batch of civil services, you've had the highest number of Muslims in the IAS in the whole history of independent India. Something for which our Minister for Minority Affairs took the credit. But the fact is that there is change. But when I talk of more Muslims joining the service, there's also been a societal change in the recruitment of the civil services. When I joined the civil services, we were all children of ICS officers or army officers like myself, or what would be called the upper classes of Indian society. Now, as has been mentioned, in the case of the police service, you have people who are constables' children, superintendents' children. Many of them, of course, were trainees, IIT graduates, IMM graduates. Many of them who were my trainees. Did I find any change in their attitudes? For example, as I told you, I was the only Indian Muslim in the civil services, all the civil services at that time. Nobody made me feel very, ye ek Musalman yahan se aa gaya. I hadn't even noticed it till Mr. Chanchal Sarkar appeared to interview me. Now, because there's a greater input from the rural sector, a number of recruits in the civil services, when I was director, were actually graduates from district colleges. People who had been educated in villages. There's now a young man who heads the traffic police in the state of J&K, who had never been to a city till the time that he had qualified to study in college. He learnt English only after joining the civil services. Whereas we in our time all prided ourselves on how good we were at English. And he's a leading civil servant, an outstanding police officer of the J&K cadre at this stage. So that typifies the change. But because of that, these castes and religious prejudices also started becoming manifest. You, sir, you spoke about the demolition of the Babri Masjid in 1992. I was in the academy in 2002 when the riots took place, described often as a pogrom in Gujarat. And here, the different views that were expressed, I had to go out and appeal to the officer trainees that you're talking about how many Muslims have been killed, how many Hindus have been killed. I appeal to you to please think of the great shame of how many Indians have been killed. And killed at the hands of whom? Not at the hands of Pakistanis, not at the hands of Chinese, but killed at the hands of Indians. That is what you ought to be thinking of. But the very fact that they thought otherwise, I think typifies the kind of attitudes that have been developing over the decades. I would not agree. Said I would not agree with you specifically. That we need to conserve the civil services as they have been built over the years as a safeguard of the Constitution and constitutional values in our country. Because I do not believe the civil services are, the way they are designed, are a reliable safeguard of those principles. The civil services, I have written about this also. You mentioned that I've been writing and appearing on TV and so on. But certainly, I've written of this also. Our civil services are designed not to get exhilarated over change, as you mentioned, that they should be getting excited over change. They're designed to maintain the status quo. They were specifically designed by the colonial rulers for that purpose. But they drew down, I might say, on the Mughal structure in a very key institution in our civil services, which is the district magistrate. You do not have a district magistrate anywhere in England. You had a district magistrate in India, coming down from the old Mughal entity of the Amal Guzar. And very often, for a long time, and still to this day, district magistrates are often called collectors. Although there's nothing to collect at this stage, except maybe to line their own pockets, but nevertheless, the collector was supposed to be the collector of land revenue. And that institution had been designed from Mughal times to actually collect the land revenue and therefore also administer the area in that effort. Now that is not a structure which is suitable to a dynamic, changing, professional society. What is required is greater professionalism in the service, where the service, and we all know this, is designed to promote generalism. An IAS officer prides himself on being a generalist. But generalism, if I may use that term, is not the need of the hour today. Also, in a democracy, you cannot have a civil service as the guarantor of your constitutional values. Because the civil service is neither, and particularly as designed by us, is neither transparent nor accountable. Now, how is that supposed to be the guarantor of the constitutional values? The guarantor of the constitutional values is the people themselves, and has to stem from the institutional framework, of which we have a plenty in our country, which is expected to design the safeguarding of those values. Institutions like the courts, like the commissions, of which you have been member and I have been member, and so forth. So in looking to that, scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, women's commission, so on, we have a number of institutions. The question then that we should be asking ourselves is not whether changing the civil services is going to compromise our idea of India and our constitutional values, but we should be asking ourselves whether the watering down of these institutions, watering down if ever they were really effective enough, whether the watering down of these institutions is not actually the real danger. I put it to you that that is the danger, and that is already taking place widely. The civil services have to undergo change. You yourself, sir, in describing the prejudices that subsist in our civil services, in our country, among our people, have in fact admitted that change is required. You yourself have been a great campaigner for reform. I would go beyond the question of simply reform and talk in terms of change. And it is in that context that we have to see the changes that are now sought to be made. Two of them I can think of mentioning. One is, of course, the factor of the recruitment into the civil services and the compromising of the role of the UPSC. There's one. The other is, of course, now, which has been also talked about among ourselves, former IAS officers and so on, of lateral entry into the services at the Joint Secretary level. These are two reforms that have been talked about. Now, unfortunately, there is no cohesive plan for reform or change. Thought out, debated, discussed. During our reunion, I happened to discuss this also with the present director of the Lal Bahadur Shastri Academy, an outstanding officer, the first lady, in fact, to head that institution, with an outstanding staff, but a number of vacancies in that institution. And that institution, during the course of a 3-month foundation course, is supposed to determine which officer goes into which service and which cadre. It's an absurd idea. Obviously a knee-jerk reaction. Realizing the need for change, coming up with ideas which are shallow, not thought out, and I might even go so far as to say stupid. Now, what needs to be done is a well thought out scheme, plan, program, phased program, because in an institution like the civil services, you can't change overnight. And you add some lateral entry and you brought a change. These things don't work. Lateral entry, for example, has been tried out in the UK and has been a complete failure. Not because inducting professionals into the civil services is itself an absurd idea. Since I use the word stupid, it's in itself a stupid idea. No, not at all. But the fact is that it has to be integrated into the structure of the service, which, if it is not done, will not work. Because like in the UK, you will have all the other officers of all the other services ganging up against these intruders, not allowing them to do their work. and not working yourself. So this kind of thing doesn't work. As I said, they have to be thought out. And such institutions which then emerge have to be in line with democratic principles. I'm emphasizing that because our civil service structure at present is not designed to be accountable, transparent, answerable to the public, which is in a democracy is actually the real ruler. Now you have mentioned, sir, regarding the RTI, transparency and accountability. But is it okay that now we have an RTI and simply, if you say that, okay, we enforce the RTI, the civil service becomes accountable? That isn't going to happen. Also, I might say, that isn't happening. It will also not, thank you for the compliment of saying that the RTI seemed to work when I was there. It was really not working even then, to that extent. Because the civil services, as it is designed, will devise defense mechanisms to protect itself against those intrusions, which is already being doing, which is actually what accounts for what you perceive as a weakening of the implementation of that law. So, without going to the merits of the Right to Information Act or not, the fact is that we need to address the basic issue, and that is to bring professionalism into civil services. Here, we have to go then in determining the results, the consequences which we wish to work for. That is what conclaves like this can help in determining. What are we wishing to achieve through our civil services? That, I think, is important. I won't give you a prescription that you should be asking for this or you should be asking for that. What do we need for the civil services to be effective? And one of those things may be a guarantor of our idea of India. Because they're not designed for that purpose, their loyalty will always be suspect. Is the loyalty to the government in power? Is the loyalty to a particular ideology? The point is, that if it is required and designed to deliver a particular objective, it will have to work in accordance with that, with the professional requirements of doing this. Fortunately for our country, we have high levels of professionalism in all sectors. How do we bring that professionalism to bear in the civil services? That is the question that I want to put to you. And while putting that question to you, I would warn against compromising the existing structure as it exists without determining what we want in its place. Because at present, we have not determined that. Even if you ask, and I feel that my friend Bibek De Bruyne is the one who is behind these reforms which are coming in. A friend of mine who is now in the Niti Aayog and has earlier worked in the Rajiv Gandhi Foundation, of which also I was founder secretary. These are his ideas, certainly modern ideas taken from modern management principles. But I don't think Bibek has a clear idea of the direction he wants the civil services to take, except the rather broad and vague idea that he wants to make it a more professional, management-oriented service. Yes, very good. But how do you do that? And if you do it piecemeal, as seems to have been the effort thus far by the government, you tend to compromise the whole structure. So that even the structure, weak as it might be, or open to criticism as it is, and we have all criticized it quite openly, is better than no structure at all. Because as has been mentioned by Mr. Bharadwaj and others, if you do not have that structure, the country will not survive. So I will end with this. I just want to place these ideas before you, because these ideas are now ripe for discussion, particularly because the challenges now posed. And all those who wish to think of ourselves, as you mentioned, sir, as Indians, building our nation, feeling that these measures compromise that nation, it then becomes our duty to think of how we can preserve that nation. Not only preserve that nation, but strengthen it through institutions which will make it sturdy and strong. Thank you.